Good morning. Welcome to Community Church. Those who are here in the auditorium, as well as all of you joining us online. We are a peace and justice congregation. We've been here since 1920. We're still here and still proudly here. We're bathing in the afterglow of a beautiful event we had here last night. There were maybe about 45 people. We were celebrating Joni Mitchell and singing a lot of her songs, and we were raising money for Doctors Without Borders, and we are about to send about $1,000 worth of funds to Doctors Without Borders for Gaza relief. And in the spirit of what happened here last night, I want to open with a couple of lines from the song that I sang from Joni Mitchell. It's called Banquet. Some get the gravy, some get the gristle, some get the marrow bone, and some get nothing, though there's plenty to share. Who let the greedy in? Who let the needy out?
Hey everybody.
Mute the YouTube.
I need new faces. It's a wonderful thing. 3 different events that was the case.
That's how I welcome you. And I say, we are very glad to be joined this morning by an old friend of mine, longtime friend. I met Jennifer Armstrong maybe in 1983 or 4, the first house concert that I did at her home and the home of her sister Rebecca Armstrong. Met the two of these powerful forces in the world of music and folklore and myth. They come from this beautiful family from the Chicago area. Their parents were also singers and folklorists and artists. The Armstrongs had 2 daughters who continued the tradition, and Jennifer has 2 more who continue in that tradition. Over the years, Jennifer in Evanston, Illinois, hosted a whole bunch of house concerts for me back in the day when I was traveling and touring and chasing little gigs all over the place. This was a key stop for me, Evanston, Illinois. And Jennifer has recorded tons of music. You can find her online, Jennifer Armstrong. And she's here with us today. Unfortunately, New England has lost her. She was in Maine for a bunch of years, and now she's in Asheville, North Carolina. I want you, Jennifer, to give a huge hug to your daughter, Susanna. I miss her so much and hope that she will come to Boston to see us. She's a force of nature in the world of choral singing and choral music, traditional singing and traditional music. So, folks, welcome to our humble virtual stage from Asheville, North Carolina, or vicinity. Oh, no. Jennifer is in Illinois right now. She's living in Asheville, but she's in Illinois doing a house concert. And so Jennifer, how are you? And welcome.
I'm wonderful.
And thank you for opening this program for us.
Thank you so much, Dean. It's a pleasure to be with you in cyberspace here. This is a song I'm going to sing with you that I hope you'll sing along. It's one I learned from Guy Carawan many, many years ago. It's called Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life. Ain't you got a right? Oh, ain't you got a right? Ain't you got a right to the tree of life? Go tell all my sisters, ain't you got a right? Tell all my brothers, ain't you got a right? Tell it to the world, ain't you got a right to the tree of life? Oh, ain't you got a right? Oh, ain't you got a right? Ain't you got a right to the tree of life? So rocky is the road, so dangerous is the journey, so rocky is the road, tree of life. Ain't you got a right? Oh, ain't you got a right? Ain't you got a right to the tree of life? My life will be sweeter when your life is sweeter. We've all got a right to the tree of life. Oh, ain't you got a right? Oh, ain't you got a right? Yes, we've all got a right to the tree of life. Thank you.
Arrived at a pinnacle moment that happens every 2 months, which is we have a brand new newsletter that tells you all about 2 months worth of programming at Community Church, which will take us to our final summertime break. And it starts this morning with Charlie Gallagher, who is here with us this morning. Next Sunday, Pashtana Durrani, who is from Afghanistan. She just published a book that's called Last to Eat, Last to Learn. And her focus is girls' education in Afghanistan, which is not an easy path right now. We're looking forward to hearing from Pashtana Durrani. She is at Wellesley doing graduate work. Week after that, April 21st, Jenny Stevens, no relation. Her program is called, her title is Climate Justice and Transformative Economic Change. And the next day is May Day, and we have a program about May Day and the fight for shorter hours. The presenter is John Proctor and the Boston Labor Solidarity Committee. The week after that, we have New Immigrants and Refugee Visions. These are short films made by recent immigrants to Boston area. CS Films is Michael Sheridan's nonprofit, which teaches underserved, vulnerable people all over the world filmmaking and documentary making. We have somebody from Uganda, somebody from China, and Mohammed Arifuzaman, I hope I said that right, from Bangladesh. So 3 short films. The week after that, we have Rabbi Shoshana Mera Friedman talking about My Neurodivergent Journey, the Celebration of Autistic Culture and Liberation. Shoshana Mera Friedman. And May 19th, Thriving Survivors of the PIC. If you don't know what that is, it's the Prison Industrial Complex. We have 3 beloved members and friends of Community Church who are going to tell us how each one survived the hell of prison and now thrive as compassionate contributors to humanity in these troubled times. May 26th, Jill Stein and Miko Peled, and that is something I can hardly wait to hear. Miko has told us he's going to fly up from DC for this. He says this is too important an event to just join virtually. So he will be here in person with Jill, and they will have a conversation. Jill, of course, is the presidential candidate of the Green Party and a longtime friend of this church and of this person. And Miko Peled, of course, is Israeli, born and grew up in Israel, son of a prominent general in the IDF, and who parted ways with Zionism. So that is going to be really wonderful, important program. We also have, as part of our monthly JFK speech memorial committee, Dennis Kucinich, April 10th. And the entire back, which I won't go through right now, is all concerts and cultural events that we have here. Maura Smiley, Ketu Aladua joins us in a couple of weeks. He's a liberation, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist poet. Ketu Oladua, Adam Ezra, the leader of a very hardworking, very popular indie band, is doing a solo concert for us. Betsy Rose, longtime legendary songwriter and performer from Boston, but moved to Berkeley, California about 20 years ago, doing a comeback here, or not a comeback, just visiting here, and I'm sure it'll be a great night of music. And finally, Dean Stevens, that would be yours truly, 70th birthday party, complete benefit for Community Church of Boston in these times of need where we have no tenant on the first floor. So a bunch of stuff. Don't forget, I almost forgot this, our monthly Peña, which happens here. This one, it's always the second Saturday of each month. And a peña is a Latin American style open mic. You don't have to be from Latin America, but that's where the word comes from. And this is driven by some of our wonderful Latin American members and board members as well that do this. And there's always really good food and refreshments, and even beverages of an adult sort, as well as of a regular sort, and it's called the Peña. Next one is April 13th. I think I got through a whole bunch of announcements about upcoming stuff, and I want to be briefer and less loquacious on that. I want to get to our speakers and our musicians, and this is the moment that we call the musical message, where we hear from Jennifer. I think my favorite part of this job is being music director and getting to present an enormous variety of music of all genre and all sort here. And Jennifer Armstrong is no exception, and we'll hear the musical message, maybe a couple of songs or something like that. Jennifer!
Great, thank you, Dean. This is actually a song that Dean requested I sing for you today. It's one I wrote back in 2001, and it's called My Son. They came to me today with stories of you, my son. Terrible stories, how can they be true? They told me you took a gun into your school today. They asked, did I know your plan? What could I say? If I had known, if I had only known what you were going to do, what you were going to do. If I had known, if I had only known, I'd have cut open my heart and pulled you inside. They came to me today with stories of you, my son. Terrible stories, how can they be true? They told me with a bomb in your hands, you ran into the temple. They asked, did I know your plan? What could I say? If I had known, if I had only known what you were going to do, what you were going to do. If I had known, if I had only known, I'd have cut open my heart and pulled you inside. They came to me today with stories of you, my son. Terrible stories, how can they be true? They told me you flew a plane into tall twin towers. They asked, did I know your plan? What could I say? If I had known, if I had only known what you were going to do, what you were going to do. If I had known, if I had only known, I'd have cut open my heart and pulled you inside. Yes, I'd have cut open my heart and pulled you inside. Seeing the sign there, thank you. Seeing the sign you have there in your community church of Free Palestine, I'd love to share with you before my second song a poem I wrote recently. I heard a wonderful, wonderful interview with a humanitarian aid worker in Gaza, and that is the title of the poem. What I heard from a humanitarian aid worker in Gaza. He did not die alone, staring at an unyielding sky. His desperate eyes found mine. And there, in the bombed out street, in the pool of his blood, hand gripping hand, we pushed back against the noise, the fear, the chaos. Together, we breathed his last breath. Do not tell me I am doing nothing. I am doing the only thing we can do when everything else has failed. This next song was written by a friend up in Maine named Ethan Stokes Tischler. And it's his version of a song from Julian of Norwich's famous revelation of saying, all will be well, all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well. Something that I hope and pray is true. Children, keep growing, for the night comes in. For that night's gonna be heavy when the night comes in. And mothers, keep loving where your children been. For we're all getting a little weary of the way things have been. But all will be well. All will be well. Yes, all will be well. And all will be well. Oh, flowers, keep growing, for the wind comes in. That wind's gonna be heavy when the wind comes in. And lovers, keep loving, for the rain rain's gonna be heavy when the rain comes in. But all will be well, and all will be well. All will be well, and all will be well. Yes, children, keep growing, for the night comes in, for that night's gonna be heavy when the night comes in. And mothers keep loving, for the rain comes in. For we're all growing a little weary of the way things have been. But all will be well, and all will be well. Yes, all will be well, and all will be well. Yes, all will be well. All will be well. Yes, all will be well, and all will be well.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. All will be well. It will get better. You gotta have hope. When every card seems lost, you gotta have hope when you're double-crossed. You gotta have hope. When every flower is dead, you gotta have hope, even if it's just a thread. You gotta have hope. When every star burns out, you gotta have hope. One raindrop breaks the drought. You gotta have hope if you still have one breath. You gotta have hope. There is a way out yet. You gotta have hope when the rest lose faith. You gotta have hope when you meet Satan's gate. You gotta have hope when you're terrified and scared. You gotta have hope when it's too much to bear. You gotta have hope when the rest lose faith. You gotta have hope when you meet heaven's gate. A whole lot of hope creates amazing things. The most sacred sunrise that you've ever seen. The words of Tom Pacheco that I just had to recite after hearing Jennifer's song. I think for me, that's what faith is all about. It's not about God or religion. It's about hope for the future. Hope that we can figure it out. Hope that we can make a future for ourselves, for our community, for our planet. And that's enough to say. I invite you to become a member of Community Church. Do you dig what we're doing here? Is it an interesting template for you're finding hope for the future? We have a membership book that we used to use that you sign and you become a member. And we have very vague stuff in our bylaws about what it means to be a member that we have to define, but probably will never come to define completely. There is a whole section of our archives that I've designated, what is community church? And it has a pile of treatises by all these different ministers and these different people about what we are and what we aren't and what we may be and what we may not be. So, and we haven't figured out how to extend membership of Community Church to the virtual planet. Right now, it's like you have to have written your name in the membership book, but maybe that's obsolete. I don't know. We have to keep thinking about that and keep talking about that. Board of Directors, we have an annual meeting coming. Maybe we should change the bylaws to reflect that. I'm just going on, and I got to shut up and introduce this wonderful new friend that we have. His name is Charles Gallagher. Father Charles Gallagher, Society of Jesus, professor of history at Boston College. And I don't have his CV in front of me, but all I will tell you that I came to know of his work through a podcast by Rachel Maddow, who mentioned this book that was called The Nazis of Copley Square. And that really set my antenna trembling, because we are in Copley Square, of course, and Copley Square right now is a mess. It's getting a makeover, and it's been all torn up for a few months now. And particularly on this Sunday and next Sunday, drivers beware. There's no parking anywhere. There's nothing, because the Boston Marathon is coming up, and they take over this whole region. We're a block from the finish line, and so the Nazis of Copley Square is about the 1940s and the prominence of Nazism and anti-Semitism in the period between the two wars. And another reason that this really interested me is that our church has a vital role in what happened there, and we'll hear a whole lot more about it. I urge you to find out about this book, Charles Gallagher, The Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten Story of the Christian Front. And I'll tell you also that Charlie told me this morning that he started as a dishwasher on Nantucket and went to a Midwest college, and then became a priest. His formation as a priest led him to be when they found out about his research skills, to be a professor at Boston College. And the book mentions Donald Lothrop, our minister and Community Church, but I believe that Charles did not know that we still existed until I sent him an email. Charlie, we exist. Come down and see us. Come check out our archives. So that's why this is just a wonderful moment for us to welcome Charlie Gallagher. Thanks for being here, Charlie. Yeah.
So I will share the screen for our let's see here. I'll need to oh, sorry.
Is he host?
So I got multiple. I got it.
Oh, I think you got it.
Yep. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you, Jennifer Armstrong, for your beautiful melodies and tones. Thank you, Dean, for your introduction. Your work in El Salvador is such wonderful work and shares a synchronicity with what my religious order, the Society of Jesus, has been up to over the last 30 or 40 years in El Salvador and Nicaragua. I'm delighted to be here not only for the historical connections with Reverend Lothrop, but also because the headquarters of the Nazi spy organization which I stumbled upon in my research, is located a block from where I'm speaking. And in my research, I experienced just a number of kind of jaw-dropping events that I was approached by a publisher who asked me eventually what I was working on, what kind of book I was thinking of writing, and I told the editor, I sent him an email back. I said, I really can't put in an email what I've been researching, because you just can't explain finding a Nazi SS spy ring being run out of the Copley Square hotel, and that the head Nazi involved is actually an SS unknown but extremely influential Nazi who ended up in Boston. So more on all of these people later. And what I found too was one of the great voices speaking out against this unknown group. See, none of this was known publicly until my book was published, Nazis at Copley Square. So none of these connections. There was a Nazi spy ring being run. There was a British intelligence operation being put forward to thwart it, and the Nazis and the British were running circles around the FBI, and there was basically a shadow war that was being run in Boston between the Allies and the Nazis between 1939 and 1941, and then what I also found was that it kept on clandestinely through the war. And the focus of the recruitment for the Nazis was something novel, something very strange to Americans at that time, and that was they recruited religious actors. And there were Catholics in South Boston who were leaning more and more pro-fascist. And so I'll get to that as we kind of move forward here. This is, again, the copy of the book, out new in paperback. So about half the cost from about 3 months ago. And so it's kind of, as Dean said, it's kind of a strange title. But nonetheless, this is what you're seeing here. This is the Nazi, Herbert Scholz. More about him later. Tied into the pantheon of Nazi leadership, which I'll get into later. No scholar has written on him. No one's really investigated him. He's been lost to history. Justice was not served against him. And more on him later, and also in the Q&A I can let you know how he ended up. This is his target in Boston, his target for recruitment as a spy. David Kahn, who in the 1970s wrote a book called Hitler's Spies, does refer to Scholz just in a paragraph or two and calls him an energetic spy master, but isn't able to unroll all of the spy operations that Scholz did, which I kind of get into in the book. He was very successful in recruiting this gentleman, Francis P. Moran from South Boston, who was leader of a group called the Christian Front. The Christian Front, more on that group later. And as the Christian Front developed greater organization in 1939 and 1940, they set up their operations on the second floor of the Copley Square Hotel, again, just a block from where I'm standing, newly renovated, and has been there since the 1890s. So it's not the Marriott Copley, it's not the Fairmont Copley. It's kind of a small hotel right in front of the Heinz Convention Center. Claim to fame early on was that when Babe Ruth was a pitcher for the Red Sox, he lived in the Copley Square Hotel. Now, I can talk in the Q&A about how I stumbled onto this question about this group that I was interested in. Again, I had no idea they had a branch in Boston that was being shepherded by the Nazis. That was entirely new. But I knew they existed due to some previous work and a previous book I had written, and I always thought that they would be an interesting group to research and write about. 99% of the historical profession for reasons I can answer later, warded me off this topic. They said that it would not be a good topic to write about for various reasons. And then when I pitched it to a publisher, again, big academic publisher, they rejected it. So I was kind of in a bind. Because I was on the tenure track at Boston College, and you kind of need to be writing a book. And then when big academic publisher rejects your proposal, you need to figure something out. So I did something that I can mention here on a Sunday in a church. I prayed, and one of the inspirations I got was just to keep on doing what you're doing, like keep on. And I thought, well, why don't I just research the Boston unit of the Christian Front and write an article for the New England Quarterly or something. And that's when I stumbled on a released report of a German interrogation of Scholz from after World War II that was published only in 1961. And he indicated that he had been meeting secretly with Francis P. Moran and basically directing the Christian Front in Boston during the lead up to World War II. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. And that's when I found out there was more to this Christian Front than just the New York branch, which I knew about and which had been written about, but had been written off. And I decided to kind of dig further. So these are the questions. I'm a Roman Catholic priest, so I was always kind of a religious kid growing up. I liked to pray, and I liked my faith life, and that kind of carried over into my research kind of habits. Now, when I was in grad school, I went to a very secular university, and all my friends in grad school said, well, you're never going to get a job because you do religion. And I was like, yeah, right, I'm probably not going to get a job, but, I'm happy. So anyway, it worked out differently. But these are the questions that I was interested in. I wanted to make, now I take this in this book, one of my objects was to take this local history of Boston and make it global. And I did that by kind of connecting it with not only Nazi intelligence, but British intelligence, and then and Soviet military intelligence was also involved with this group by 1942. And I can get into that later as well. Then I wanted to talk about who these people were. They were basically the members of the Christian Front were Roman Catholics and other Christians who today would be described as right-wing or conservative, ultra-conservative, I would say. And they had been written out of the historiography for a long, long time for various reasons in the historical profession. The historical profession didn't want to pay attention to them in the 1960s, really through the 2000s, early 2010s. I thought they were interesting people to write about because A, because they'd never been written about, but B, because I think they had impact, and I thought they needed to be written about. So I wanted to get into what their lived experience was of religion that pushed them into these kind of political vortices that were so much different than what I was experiencing in contemporary religion. And then these were kind of the hoped for outcomes. I wanted to, so people who had written about the Christian Front were political historians, and they didn't know much or anything about theology. And again, I was kind of a religious kid. I liked studying theology. I'm not a theologian, but I studied to be a priest, so I have these kind of basic theological things, theological degrees. And I wanted to basically create an engagement between political historians and theologians, and then also ministers and clergy. That's where I really feel most rewarding. The most rewarding part of my research is actually talking to church people, to ministers, about these issues of kind of asymmetric political activity that can come about through religious recruitment, and then kind of issues about anti-Semitism and Christianity as well. And then also, my first book, one of the areas of research that kind of was unique about my first book that was called Vatican Secret Diplomacy was that when I was an undergrad, I had a professor who was a historian of the FBI, and he taught us how to get Freedom of Information Act files released. So he taught us how to write letters to the National Archives to get FBI files released. And I decided that this would be a good way to write church history, that no one had really kind of used these records to figure out church history. So I got FBI files, OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA, all these kind of different intelligence agency files. We're writing voluminous reports on religious actors, not only Catholic, but all other sorts of religions. And so I started writing church history in many cases using these documents. And then these were the kind of larger questions that I saw happening in this book. Why were these Catholics who called themselves Christians, the group is called the Christian Front. As we'll see, they adopted violence and terrorism as a technique for not only publicity, but for what they believed was their true calling. And then secondly, as we move into the Boston situation, what's the moral calculus that drove a seemingly devout American Catholic and his group to work with a Nazi SS officer to meet basically the goals of German nationalism and Nazism? And keep in mind, no one knew that Francis Moran had been recruited by Herbert Scholz to be basically a Nazi spy. That relationship was never made known until the book was published. Moran in his day was getting headlines across the city in multiple, the Boston Herald Traveler, the Boston Post, the Boston Daily Globe, as it was called then. So he was getting huge headlines. And so it was part of my question was, how did this guy make a moral calculation to do this? What was behind that? And then he brought his group along. And the group was very unique. I mean, it wasn't, these are kind of, as I characterized them earlier, right-wing, kind of conservative Christians, but it doesn't fit the usual footprint. For example, they did not believe in white supremacy. They had African-American members within the Christian Front who were quite active. The reason for that is, in their view, Christian baptism, absolved all racial differences and created a community of believers. So therefore, whatever color you were, racial pigmentation of skin didn't matter as long as you were baptized into Christ Jesus. The majority of the members of this group were women, for example, which is very interesting in a lot of ways. And women were very involved with not only the organization, but the activity of the group. This is their inspirational leader, Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin is a radio priest from from Detroit. He has a weekly radio show which by the late 1930s attracts 30 million listeners every week. Keep in mind there's no television at this point. Keep in mind too that the highest rated current TV shows in the US attract only 12 million viewers per week. This guy had 30 million. He was a priest who was quickly becoming a political figure. He was Canadian, so he couldn't run for president, but by 1936, he had created a political party which ran a candidate for president in 1936. They got shellacked. And after the 1936 election, there were a number of things that were happening globally that pushed him towards creating this kind of group called the Christian Front, which would be his religious movement, and which would also act politically for him. These are the kind of, when I write the book, this is the big academic publisher who published it. Like you have to kind of provide some kind of egghead stuff to get the thing rolling. So what my contribution was to take what political historians had written about the group, which was minimal, but turn that on its head and make it important in connection to the theological impulses which I felt was pushing this group to be able to become a unified national movement. And these were some principles within the dominant Catholic theologies of the time in the 1930s and 40s, which we don't know about today because they dissolved by the 1960s. The first was Catholic Action, a movement started in the Vatican in the early 1920s, which started originally as a social uplift movement, but then moved later on to become an anti-communist movement. And then the theological impulse, which was called Mystical Body of Christ theology. I felt that theology, which kind of galvanized Catholics globally and obliterated borders. In other words, this theology took St. Paul's letter to the Romans, talking about the part to the whole, the head to the members of the body. And it basically meant that if Catholics were being harmed somewhere in the world, then that pain that was being meted out against Catholics, either in Mexico, where there was a Catholic persecution, or in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, where there was a Catholic persecution, that pain in Barcelona was felt in Boston through this theology of Mystical Body of Christ theology, which was dominating both Catholic press, Catholic publishing, Catholic ideas at the time. And Father Coughlin moved in these circles and moved those ideas along. And I think it allowed for these kind of this paramilitary side of the Christian front to move forward. So in January of 1940, the Christian front was charged with sedition. Their headquarters were raided by the FBI. They were charged with an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States. The FBI raided their headquarters in Brooklyn, New York, and the group had been caching weapons all along, building bombs in the basement of their apartments in Brooklyn, and the membership numbers by this time were about 100,000 on the East Coast. But what was going on was there was a public-facing side of lay Catholics, in other words, non-clerical Catholics, ordinary Catholics, who would go to the meetings, which were about 2 or 3 times a week, to hear speakers which mixed politics with religion and prayer and meditation. And then there was a paramilitary side of cells. When you filled out your membership application for the Christian Front, you always put down whether you had military training or not. And then usually the men who had military training would be recruited to join what were called action committees, cells of about 10 to 15 members that would be trained in firearms because they were convinced that the Communist Party in the United States was planning an overthrow of the U.S. government, and that the Roosevelt administration had been peppered with communists in higher administration and in the judiciary, and they had a plan of attack to start a counter-revolution in early 1940 against the encroachment of communists within government. This was a huge case. They had their own philosophy for it, which I refer to as the false flag defensive counterattack strategy. To our view, it looks cockamamie and strange, but in my view, if you don't understand what's motivating these people, then you're not going to understand why they're acting the way they are. And so at the time and since, people who've looked at the group have called them a bunch of crazies and dismissed the organization and its sedition plot as so fantastical that it would never amount to anything in the first place. I was the first historian to treat it seriously, mainly because my job when I was in college, I was a summer police officer and I was being trained on semi-automatic weaponry. So when I saw an Enfield M19, I kind of knew the firepower there, and I knew not to take a group that's carrying military-grade weaponry unseriously. So I decided to dig further. I was very much engaged in trying to figure out what motivated these people. And so you can read about that in the book. It's a fascinating, really, ideology mixing religion and political asymmetric action, which is basically terrorism. There's a very chilling section in the book where they are kind of making bombs in their basement, and I got a verbatim from an FBI report. The FBI was able to get a plant inside the group, and it's a rather chilling story. Anyway, this plot was coast to coast. The headlines were everywhere. They would also pray before they did target practice, and then during target practice on Sunday mornings, they would get up early and shoot target practice. Then they'd break and go to church for an hour, and then come back and do more target practice. I mean, that just fascinates me. I was like, and then, you know, keep in mind, like, everybody, all my friends from grad school and all, like, I went to a professor when I was undergrad, and I said, I want to write a research paper on this group. And he told me not to, because it never amounted to anything and it wasn't worth researching. And so it kind of stuck with me for all these years. And sure enough, once I got the FBI file released, it was unbelievable. And then as we go on, you know, we'll see this is connected to New York, the New York Christian Front. These were coast to coast headlines in January of 1940, and then somehow the plot and the group just kind of faded off of the radar. So then, what's interesting is that on the day of these arrests in New York, Reverend Lothrop here in this church was scheduled to debate the leader of the Christian Front in Boston, Francis P. Moran. And he's pictured here on the telephone, apparently smiling happily, but he's supposed to be learning of the arrests of the New York seditionists in this phone call. Now, clearly it's a staged photo, but that's the leader of the Christian Front in Boston. He was a firm lieutenant of Father Coughlin. He had been receiving directions secretly from Father Coughlin in Detroit. He was an excellent political organizer. He was a dropout from a Catholic Franciscan seminary. And when interestingly enough, he went as a 16-year-old to go study to be a priest. He didn't join the Boston Archdiocese. He wanted to join the Franciscans, which is a mendicant order dedicated to relief of the poor. The seminary he ends up at is located in Callicoon, New York, and it's staffed by a bunch of German Franciscans whom Bismarck had kicked out of Germany in the 1870s during the Kulturkampf, and they ended up in upstate New York. One of the results is this Irish Catholic working class kid, youngest in his family of 11, he ends up becoming fluent in German as a result of his seminary training. Then, after about 3 years of training in the seminary, it's time for first vows, which is where he's going to vow chastity. And fair enough, he decides he doesn't want to do that the rest of his life. And he kind of gets released from the seminary and comes back to Boston, and is a great businessman selling insurance for John Hancock Insurance. He's one of their best salesmen. But then you can kind of read about his life as an insurance salesman and political organizer. He's very truculent as a political organizer, and he's thoroughly devoted to Father Coughlin. This is then on the day of the arrests in New York, just to kind of keep us up to speed, he accepts an invitation from the leader of this church, Reverend Lothrop, to debate this question at the Boston Community Church. And because the lines of communication were so slow, while he's debating on that Sunday night, February 14th, in Boston, the press hasn't broken the story of the New York seditionists. So there's very little coverage of Moran and Lothrop's original speech, where Lothrop invited Moran to come to this church to explain his organization. And so what happens is Moran gives kind of an explanation and defense of his organization, and the chatter is kind of benign, and nothing really goes on. And then the next day, on the Monday, that coast-to-coast press coverage starts with the Christian Front. This is a photograph of Lothrop, Reverend Lothrop. Very hard to find photographs of Lothrop, by the way. And so he is he's invited Moran in, and Moran gives this speech. And then the next day, the arrests occur, and Lothrop becomes infuriated that he has entertained this leader of the Christian Front in Boston the day before the arrests were made public, and now decides he has to defend both himself and his organization. And you can see this is a part of the book that I talk about, this exchange where he says, and Moran says, basically, the question was about constitutional protections, and he says, Moran argues Nazis, fascists, and communists should be denied these constitutional protections because they're basically revolutionary in nature. I mean, there's still a debate among scholars whether Nazism is a revolutionary philosophy or not. And clearly, Marxist-Leninism becomes much more revolutionary. And so this is what kind of Moran comes to Boston Community Church and argues along these lines. Keep in mind, after these arrests in February 1940, membership in the Christian Front in Boston declines precipitously because they're being charged with overthrowing the U.S. government. It's one of the things that attracted me to the group in the first place, because in my Sunday school, I was always taught that Catholics were good patriots. Okay, I got my PhD, and basically I can tell you, Catholics make bad citizens. They're not the best when it comes to citizenship. Moran is kind of taking these protections and talking about them in a way that kind of combines Nazism, fascism, and communism all together, because he has not yet met his future mentor. He says here, it's a heated discussion because the next week, Reverend Lothrop interrupts the Christian Front meeting at a Knights of Columbus Hall, and they have a heated discussion. I mean, you can imagine what this is going to be. So he goes onto Christian Front territory, Lothrop does, and starts. You can read the accusations in the book. He basically does a laundry list, calling Moran a seditionist, linking him to the New York sedition leaders, and kind of a laundry list of connections with anti-Semitism and pro-fascism on the part of Moran at his own meeting. They basically said Mr. Moran accused Mr. Lothrop of being. So when Lothrop accused Moran of being a fascist, Moran accused Lothrop of being a communist. These are accusations that Lothrop's going to hear about for most of his career, basically by government folks, by other church leaders, that Lothrop is considered to be an agent of the, at least the Communist Party USA. These are kind of, the debate is, the original debate and Lothrop's intervention at the Christian Front meeting is very newsworthy. There's a lot of news coverage on that. This is the Boston Community Church News, where we are now. You can email me or Dean to actually read this if you'd like. We can send this to you on PDF. This is Lothrop's kind of point-by-point charges against the Christian Front. Lothrop here is very prescient. He's really not only a forward thinker, but a forward speaker against Moran. And he's a quick study on what the Christian Front is all about, because Moran is extremely shrewd. Another observer in Boston called him a slippery fish. He is a shrewd political manipulator, Moran. If he were actually in party politics, he'd probably work his way up to the top. He's extremely well-versed in anticipating moves and being a step ahead of everyone else. I mean, this is a guy that outfoxed the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, Military Intelligence Division, the OSS. I mean, no one knew that this guy was a spy for the Nazis until the book was published in 2021. And he was able to escape justice. He should have been in jail for a long time for violating the Espionage Act, for violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Both of them should have, both Scholes and Moran. But he was able to skirt it because he was just really shrewd. Again, Moran kind of it wasn't his talk at the Boston Community Church wasn't considered newsworthy because the Christian Front wasn't newsworthy. But then the next week after the sedition accusations in New York, there's a great uproar. Now, so there are 3 points about the debate when it was made. What was difficult for the press was that with these accusations of being Nazis and communists between the two, Moran and Lothrop, everybody forgets that the Nazis and the communists were in a pact between 1939 and 1941. They were kind of like shaking hands. They weren't necessarily, the Russians don't like to hear that they were in an embrace, but they were definitely in a firm handshake, and they were kind of working on the same side. And then we know after the Nuremberg trials that there were military protocols within the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that really made them military allies between 1939 and 1941. Now, keep in mind, too, my take on Lothrop is that he became much more politically motivated, much more politically sensitized as a religious leader during the period of the Spanish Civil War. The period of the Spanish Civil War was the period of the popular front positioning of the Communist Party internationally, and that meant that they would tamp down their revolutionary rhetoric and basically decide to work with pro-democracy and pro-freedom, pro-liberal causes in order to kind of make inroads through the electoral process, particularly in the United States. Now, it was pushed back to that, the Lovestonites and others, but by and large, the Spanish Civil War, in my view, metastasized Lothrop's political activity as a religious leader, particularly in Boston. If you read, now keep in mind, everybody is calling, by 1939 even, many people in Boston are calling Reverend Lothrop a communist. Reverend Lothrop says, prove it, but basically, if you look at, the greatest press coverage that Lothrop receives during this period is in the Daily Worker, actually. Local press and national press kind of don't see him as a huge leader, but the Communist Party of the United States does. In fact, he wrote a letter of support for Earl Browder in 1939. He wrote a personal letter to President Roosevelt in support of the Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party of the United States at that time. So he's going to have this back and forth about whether he's a communist or not. That's going to come up years. But for our purposes, the importance is that it's Lothrop who early on is calling out Moran as not only a pro-fascist and potentially a pro-Nazi. But he's talking about Moran in terms that should be chilling to at least the Boston community, if not the national scene. And his voice is actually not listened to, Lothrop, and he's right on. Like when you read what Lothrop is saying about Moran, every point he's making about Moran and his pro-fascism, his anti-Semitism, his anti-democratic attitudes, right on point. And so what happens is the FBI notices actually that there's no linkage being made between the Boston Christian Front and the New York Christian Front. And the big push by Lothrop was to make that connection. The problem is no one listened to him. In fact, at the trial in New York, then the Christian Fronters are off the hook. They get essentially acquitted. And so you can read about that in the book. The prosecutor for the government was a guy named O. John Rogie. I would call him the dumbest smart guy ever to graduate from Harvard Law School. He lost every big case that he adjudicated. He wouldn't know a syllogism if it hit him in the face. I worked in his papers at Harvard Law School archives. I just don't know why he couldn't argue clearly. But nonetheless, he wasn't able to get these cats prosecuted, and they got off. Now, one of the reasons was, I don't want to go into this. It's kind of interesting. In 1939, if you were a member of the National Rifle Association, you could order military-grade weaponry from the Department of War and have it shipped to your doorstep. Okay, you could fill out a form, send your NRA membership number. The rifles, these M19 Enfields, would be shipped, and also cordite for making bombs. It would be shipped to your local armory, and then for an extra $1.50, you could have it shipped from the local armory to your doorstep. So you were receiving military-grade weaponry. Now, granted, these are World War I rifles, but these World War I rifles are shooting a 30-06 shell. That might not mean anything to anyone in the Boston Community Church, but basically, the bullets shot by those rifles that you saw in the picture are 2 times the size of what the U.S. Army currently uses, and that's because the U.S. Army can carry more bullets onto the battlefield if they use the smaller ones. And each one of the bullets in those old rifles each one of the bullets can go through a brick wall, which is something a NATO round cannot do now. So they were loaded for bear, as they say, and it was. And the problem was the FBI and the prosecutor had no idea that there was this kind of codicil in the U.S. Army Code that allowed members of the NRA to actually purchase these weapons through the NRA legally. And my view is that the government thought that that the Christian Front had stolen all these weapons from National Guard armories, because probably 75% of the members of the action committees were members of the National Guard, and they thought they were going to get them on theft of weapons from armories charges. Each rifle theft is a 35-year charge, and they thought they were going to get them on that. And then it turns out that both the prosecutor, Director Hoover of the FBI, nobody knew anything about this NRA thing, and that the sedition charge was kind of the publicity charge, the headline charge. Because they were trying to overthrow the U.S. government, you actually have to have action on the Capitol, which kind of is creepy given the January 6th events, which actually puts the activity at the Capitol. But it has to be armed activity. And this was armed activity, but it was taking place in Brooklyn to try to, and the government was trying to kind of convince the jury that they were going to overthrow the legislative process in the Capitol. That didn't quite work. So anyway, these cats were all acquitted. It was a wild thing. So when they were acquitted, because of the bad publicity, the New York group gets shut down, mainly because there's just such bad publicity in New York. All the leadership had been rounded up and put in jail. They'd been released. And in fact, the day in the court when they got acquitted, the leader of the New York Christian Front went to the judge and asked for his guns back. And he left the court building in New York carrying his weapons out onto the street. But nonetheless, you had this issue with Moran up here, who's a very savvy political organizer, trying to keep his branch of the Christian Front going in the midst of this bad publicity from the FBI, which was coast to coast. And only because he's such a shrewd operator and public speaker and organizer, was he able to keep the thing going. By the spring and summer of 1940, the organization was about to be shut down. Okay. And mainly because of the work of Reverend Lothrop of this church, Moran's publicity in Boston was of the worst kind. He was running out of money. He was running out of steam. And he was basically about to die on the vine. He had tried to get a formal affiliation with the Archdiocese of Boston. Now, Cardinal William O'Connell of Boston is usually vilified by liberals and liberal historians. But the one thing he did do that was good is that he rejected Moran's pleas for the Christian Front to become an official organization of the Archdiocese, which would have given Moran legitimacy and a lifeline. And Moran eschewed, or excuse me, Cardinal O'Connell eschewed Moran, and then Moran was about, the organization was about to die, and then something happened. Moran started getting recruited by the gentleman here in the civilian suit. I'm not sure what side of the photo he'd be on, but the guy in the double-breasted suit is Herbert Scholz. And Herbert Scholz is the German consul in Boston. He had been sent here in 1938, and this is his lineage. As a young man, as a member of the Brown Shirts, he had had a romantic relationship with Ernst Röhm, seen here with the swastika. Ernst Röhm was the founder with Adolf Hitler of the Brown Shirt, the SA. There was a falling out between Röhm and Hitler in 1934 called the Night of the Long Knives. You can read about that. The result of which is that Röhm ends up being murdered in prison. Scholz ends up making a decision to accept an overture from Heinrich Himmler, seen here in the military hat with skull and crossbones. Himmler is the architect of the Holocaust, and he kind of adopts Scholz and asks Scholz to leave the Brown Shirts and join his group, the Black Shirts, which he does, and thereby doing he saves his skin. And his first job in the Nazi movement of any import is as the aide-de-camp to Rudolf Hess, who's the deputy Führer. So in 1938, this is the gentleman who comes to Boston to be the German consul, and he is an energetic spy recruiter because Hess, if there's one thing Hess taught Scholz, was how to do spy work. The reason he comes to Boston is that the newspapers got it all wrong. Basically, the media didn't know what they were talking about, and they said that Scholz had come to Boston in 1938 because he'd committed a diplomatic faux pas in Washington at some point, and he was sent to Boston. But in fact, he came to Boston because the former chancellor of the Weimar Republic, the longest-serving chancellor of the Weimar Republic, was living in Boston. A guy named Heinrich Brüning, who had negotiated with Hitler the transition laws on the chancellor, between the parliament and the chancellor, and he escaped. Brüning escaped Germany in 1937 and was teaching political science at Harvard. And after Kristallnacht in November of 1938, the persecution against the Jews in Germany, Brüning started giving more anti-Hitler speeches publicly. And Himmler and Hitler decided that Brüning needed to have the screws turned. And they sent Scholz to Boston to turn the screws on Brüning. And he ran a chilling intimidation campaign against Brüning, which you can read about in the book. And then as 1940 came into view, Scholz was looking around for potential targets for recruitment, and he landed on Moran, and the two of them struck up what I call one of the most secretive and efficient espionage and propaganda relationships of World War II that had never been, not only had not been discovered, but had never been kind of written about or examined. Here's a picture of Scholz at his consulate in Boston on Chestnut Street on Beacon Hill. Rather chilling. He has an illustrious career. This is a photo of the consulate. That's 2 blocks from the State House. It's around the corner from where John Kerry lives. It's one of the most exclusive addresses in Boston. It's a rather chilling photo itself. These are just the schematic of kind of what's going on. Now, when Lothrop was giving his speech against Moran, my view is that Moran had not yet been recruited to spy for Scholz. We have definitive documentary proof that they met secretly in July of 1940 I have what I call ideological proof that they met earlier than that, probably the spring of 1940, because the Christian Front newsletters begin to kind of profile Nazism, Nazi aims, as early as March, April of 1940. But when Lothrop gave his speech against Moran, my sense is that Moran was floundering and that the movement was about to be shut down. And that Lothrop, because Lothrop could not get any other publicity in Boston to move with him to condemn Moran, they were basically afraid of Moran. A lot of the press was afraid of Moran because Moran's organization was Catholic. And the Catholic Church in Boston institutionally had clout, both in the press and in the police. So Lothrop's kind of the red tag of Lothrop. I mean, as early as I think 1938, 39, this church was being. In fact, when I was coming down, I said, I'm quite honored to come and speak at what one headline called the hub of red activity in Boston. So all of this was in the air at the time, and so Lothrop was kind of not able to get traction. What you see here is numbers. The Christian Front in New England's 30,000 members by 1941. When he starts receiving money and direction from Scholz. And you have all of these, you have 5 of these intelligence agencies monitoring the Christian Front, and none of them, this is your grandparents' tax money at work, none of them were able to figure out that Scholz had recruited Moran to be an agent for the Nazis. It was just wild stuff. The only organization that had a true inkling of it and wanted to push it was the Office of Naval Intelligence. They were the head of the naval district here was convinced that Scholz had recruited Moran as a spy, but that admiral of the naval district in Boston at some dinner party made a wisecrack about him kind of being a Nazi spy himself, like kind of, ha ha ha, I'm a Nazi spy. And then that kind of put forward an investigation into that admiral as a Nazi spy. And so his reports to try to get Moran investigated went nowhere in Washington because his superiors all thought that he was a Nazi spy. It's really kind of wild. As Johnny Carson used to say, wild and weird stuff. This is a little slide about an initiative by Moran and Scholz to get the U.S. Army to adopt a rifle for its main battle weapon. This is called the Johnson semi-automatic rifle. And in the summer of 1940, Moran and Scholz brought in speakers, brought in U.S. Marines to try to push members of the Christian Front to write letters to their congressman, to write letters to the editor, to make a fuss to have the U.S. Army adopt the Johnson semi-automatic rifle, which no one has ever heard of. Actually kind of a good weapon. Because the Senate was debating whether to adopt the Johnson rifle or the M1 Garand rifle. Flash back to the slide where I showed the Nazi swastika flag out in front of the German consulate. That was being held that was being flown because the Germans had been successful in invading Holland and the Low Countries, and the Dutch had actually purchased 30,000 of the Johnson rifles, and so the Nazis came into possession of 30,000 Johnson rifles. And it sounds strange to our ears now, but the Nazis couldn't. Technically, they had a hard time creating a semi-automatic weapon, a semi-automatic rifle. That technology really emerged in the mid-1930s, about 1935, and they really couldn't get they had bolt-action rifles that were excellent, but they couldn't quite get a good semi-automatic rifle produced. The Johnson rifle, that technology was sold to Armalite Corporation after the war, which produces the AR-15, which you know about in the news today. So the technology was created by Johnson who was an inventor from Boston. But that's besides the point. So the reason I like to show this slide is that so many times people who study political historians who study religion say it doesn't matter, it doesn't amount to anything. This is the Senate Armed Services Committee. You're not going to see this on the floor of the Senate anytime soon. But many historians say, well, it doesn't, religion doesn't matter because the only place that matters during wartime is the battlefield and economics. And I'm trying to show that no, religion here is trying to play a role in getting the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, to adopt a battle weapon, which would have been to the advantage of the Germans for the entire war, because they had the engineering of the weapon already. They could not get the tech specs. They tried to steal the tech specs to the Garand, but couldn't do it. And then Sholes had Moran go give talks at Camp Edwards and Cape Cod and in Fort Devens. He would go give religious talks to Catholic soldiers, and then he would be debriefed by Sholes back at the consulate secretly. They would speak in German. Sholes gave Moran a code name. They would talk in German and be debriefed. The German intelligence was hungry for intelligence on U.S. Army bases, and so that was another thing. Then to kind of move quickly here, British intelligence saw the activity of the Christian Front in Boston booming under the tutelage of Sholes. Now, they didn't know, British intelligence did not know that Sholes was running Moran as an agent, but they just saw the membership numbers tick up, and they were undergoing the Battle of Britain at the time, and so this William Stevenson, who was the British spy in New York running passport control in Rockefeller Center, he decided to have British intelligence mount an operation in Boston to suppress the Christian Front. This is all illegal. No one knew about this operation until I stumbled upon it in the British archives. It's entirely unconstitutional. It's entirely illegal. The British, they're on the same side, but in my view, they should be prosecuted just like Sholes and Moran should be prosecuted. And some say it was because they're, it's a special relationship, but in my view, it's not that special that they can be running clandestine operations. They destroyed all the documents to this operation as well. So I was gratefully, Stevenson was a megalomaniac, and he wrote reports on the operation to Winston Churchill. So those reports survived in the SOE, Special Operations Executive Files, which was Churchill's private subversive warfare group that he ran. So that's how we know about it. They came and they set up an organization called the Irish American Defense Association, which was kind of like a neighborhood watch group, but it was completely constructed, orchestrated, supported, and run by MI6, British intelligence. They kind of, again, there's kind of always a Jesuit involved here. Stevenson's kind of attention was piqued because of a radio broadcast by a priest at Boston College pointing out how Catholics could now go ahead and join the Christian Front in Boston. So the British set up this operation, the Irish American Defense Association, again, kind of a neighborhood watch group, patriotic group, but they needed someone to run it, and they recruited a young woman who was, they recruited him through a cutout who's a go-between who no one knows the identity of. I think I know who the identity of the cutout is. They're basically an American who's working for British intelligence. I think I know who the cutout is, but I think the person's family could sue me if I said it, so I'm not going to say it on YouTube. But if you want to write to me privately, I could tell you what I think. This is what happened. This is the person they recruit, and it's a woman who runs a group called runs something called the Boston City Reporter. She's a journalist, a young journalist, a Catholic. She's a liberal Catholic, one of 6 of them probably in Boston at the time, and she's very pro human rights, pro-civil rights. She also works as secretary to Granville Hicks, who was the first communist to be hired at Harvard. Hicks actually breaks with the communists later on after the purges and becomes basically a regular kind of liberal. But what was motivating Frances Sweeney was that she believed that anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics was a sin, and she wanted to see that stopped in Boston. She was unwitting. She had no idea that she was being supported by British intelligence. They bought her they set her up with an office in the Little Building right on Boston Common. At the time, it was probably the most expensive office building. They paid for everything. They paid her salary. They paid her kind of letterhead. They paid all of her bills. And this is kind of how we know that we also have her pay stubs. So technically she should have been prosecuted under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, because even though she was on the right side, she was still working for a foreign country as an agent and getting paid for it. And she was doing this kind of as anti-fascist work. So it's really interesting. The spy stuff is kind of crazy around here because, again, she's a dynamo, by the way. She goes and she pickets all the Christian Front meetings. She tries and she works out an operation. She works out an operation to get the local police Commissioner Timilty, to move in and arrest Moran. And she manipulates the whole thing, this Frances Sweeney. Problem is, Timilty, Police Commissioner Timilty, is a big friend of Joe Kennedy's. He actually makes a false arrest because he arrests Moran for handing out Nazi propaganda. But the United States was not at war with Nazi Germany, and the publisher of the pamphlets that he was handing out at his group meetings, Christian Front meetings, the publisher had not been convicted under the Espionage Act at all, and so that was all protected under the First Amendment. So Timothy kind of backs off on his arrest and just detains Moran, and Moran says that he's going to disband the organization, that Timothy forces that, but what happens is the organization goes underground, and my view in the book is that the organization is much more lethal underground than it is above ground. It's smaller, but it's more lethal. Then in 1943, and Reverend Lothrop is really involved in this, there's a lot of Catholic on Jewish race riots. Jewish kids getting beat up by Irish Catholic gangs, which I allege were being orchestrated by Scholz from Europe. Moran had a shortwave radio in the attic of his home, and in my view was taking orders from Scholz in Europe. Again, the FBI is totally out to lunch on all of this. The FBI agent in charge of investigating Moran in this case was the father of a prominent journalist who appears on Fox News regularly. I don't want to get sued, so I'm kind of a coward in this way, but you would know this person's name. You would know the name of the cutout, too, because that cutout ended up in a U.S. In the White House, basically, as an advisor to a succeeding president. It's just, again, crazy stuff going on here. So Reverend Lothrop tries to get the clergy in Boston to speak out against the Catholic on Jewish rioting. He's very prominent in that, but he, again, gets pushed back, what is called anti-Semitic rioting. And then there's a whole section in the book. This is just the pro-left daily from New York, PM magazine, which is basically funded by the Communist Party USA, we now know. But it's really a terrible time in 1943 for Catholic and Jewish violence. And again, I'm alleging that for a number of reasons that this is all being orchestrated by Moran in his underground state. They couldn't get anyone, according to T1 here, T1 is an informant. They they couldn't get any informant to actually go to take Moran to trial because T1, all we know about her is that she's a woman. She refuses to testify because she's afraid she'll get killed by either Scholes or Moran during the war. And then Moran turns more exterminationist against the Jews, becomes basically Nazified, and wants to use returning veterans from World War II to exterminate Jews because they have experience with firearms. That's by 1943. This is kind of an unwritten, since we're in a church today, kind of an unwritten kind of reason why I wrote the book, or why I kind of wanted to, am grateful for publicity about the book, because for the Catholic side, the Vatican currently is teaching on the Holocaust is that some Christians participated in the Holocaust out of a spirit of what they call anti-Judaism, which is a prejudice against Jews based on their religious foreignness and cultural foreignness, but not in terms of racial identity, not in terms of racial anti-Semitism, which fueled the Holocaust. So this is a 1998 document. I think it needs to be updated because my Catholics here in Boston that I'm looking at, who are going to church religiously, they're becoming more and more anti-Semitized. They're becoming more and more racially anti-Semitized and exterminationist in their view, and they're working with the Nazis. And so I would kind of, I don't know who to call on this, but I'm just a history professor, but I'd like to see that particular teaching updated to include Catholic anti-Semitism. This is to conclude, this is a note from Francis Sweeney's fiance. Francis Sweeney died walking, I think, over by the Boston Public Library, walking down a sidewalk one night. She died of heart failure at age 37 in 1944. And she had been recently fianced, and her fiance wrote these words: it just doesn't seem right that one who could see so much evil around her and spared neither time nor courage to fight it should suddenly be taken away. For us who are left behind, her deeds should be a challenge to carry on the good work that she started. So that good work is is anti-fascism and to thwart anti-Semitism and all its vestiges. Thank you very much.
Let's see. I'll grab this right here. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Do we need to share again, Amar? Okay.
This has been so rich, and we're gonna. This could have gone on way longer, and I hope it's the beginning of a relationship where you get to really have a serious look at our archives.
Absolutely.
Which are absolutely remarkable. I'm just a guitar player who discovered community church and who found these archives that had been basically relegated to a broom closet for decade after decade, and then to another broom closet when that broom closet became a room that had to be rented because we were so broke trying to keep this building going. Before we go into this, I want to thank Jennifer Armstrong. She has had to depart to pick up her sister, another beloved friend of mine who I hope will present here sometime soon, Rebecca Armstrong. She's ordained a Unitarian Universalist minister, lives in Chicago, and so thank you, Jennifer, even though you're not there. And we will be in touch soon. Jennifer and her family are beloved friends of our family as well. After saying a little pitch, which a church always has to do, what's it called, the offertory, that we rely on your largesse and your generousness to keep this thing we call community church going. And there are ways to do that on our website by credit card or by PayPal. And there are ways to do it right here in person by a basket that is in the back. We urge you, if you are a sustaining and faithful member of community church or supporter, whatever, to become a what's it called, a recurring donor on PayPal or some other function. Enough. That's enough. We did the money pitch, and now we go on to this rich conversation. Charlie, first thing I want to ask you is what you know about FOIA, Freedom of Information requests. Somebody made a suggestion, which I really want to act on, which is to get community church's FBI file over the many decades. And it must be a fat one, because in the 50s we were blacklisted and we were paraded before the Massachusetts version of the National House Un-American Activities Committee. Lothrop gave a stinging address to the joint committee on the joint session of the legislature, and I was scrambling around here for a copy of it to read a couple of quotes from it, which are just remarkable. The one thing I remember is he says, "Gentlemen, I do not subscribe to guilt by association. I subscribe to virtue by association, and that's why, just like Jesus, I associate with communists, capitalists, prostitutes, taxpayers," and it was just this really amazing address, and it was printed, and we have copies of it upstairs. But we would love to get a copy of that file, just to have as a badge of honor over the years of how we have been a thorn in the side of the dominant paradigm, you know, and that would be the first question I had for you, and also just an invitation to everybody to come to know these archives. They're not in very great organizational condition. We have taken over the 5th floor of our building, which needs a lot of work, so it can't be rented as a space. We rent to a lot of, over the years, to a lot of nonprofits that are sympathetic with our values. So the entire 5th floor has the archives all over it, and it needs a lot of work, and we are really just dedicated to the challenge of ordering, digitizing, making available those archives, which just have a really amazing historical record there. There's all the record of the programs that we've had over the years. There's a record of all of the newspaper reviews, previews, articles about community church and its activities over the many decades. There's the minutes of the board. It's all there. It just needs to be organized and digitized. So that's what I wanted to tell you, that it's just really a pleasure to have you here. I look at those archives and say this would just be a marvelous project for a researcher to write a book about this church. A book about Lothrop. We have transcripts of a lot of his sermons and our newspaper articles about places where he appeared and did things like he did in 1940, where he just took on this Christian front and right in the face, you know, just fearlessly. Yeah. Anyway, I've got to stop because I'm just so excited to have you here and have this as a jumping off point for us to really pay attention. We just haven't had the bandwidth to pay attention to our history, our archives, to not only inform our present, but to inspire our future.
Yeah, so to the FBI file question, I did most of my requests for this book prior to 2016. After 2016, it became much more difficult to get files released because of the Hillary Clinton issues and the political issues where Congress became very activated to use FOIA. So the declassification department of the FBI is in Langley, Virginia, and I have a friend who's a scholar who asked for a file to be released. Granted, it was a large one, maybe similar to Lothrop's. He was told by the FBI that this is just word of mouth, that it would take 23 years for the file to be released. So what's detrimental to those of us who are historians is that there's so much politicization, particularly of intelligence matters, that various outside organizations who have the budgets to hire the lawyers, and also Congress people, they're seeking FOIA releases all the time, and it's pushing the historians backward in the loop and or in the line. And so I agree. I think getting the institutional file on the church would be very, very interesting. Getting Lothrop's file would be very, very interesting. But, I mean, it's worth a shot. It's worth a shot. But after 2016, kind of all bets are off in terms of, so it took me 10 years to write this book, because for each FBI file I requested, I had to wait between 18 months and 2 years to get each file released. So when I got the institutional file of the Christian Front in New York released, it made clear that I needed to get the leader of the Boston, Moran's file. Well, that took another 2 years. And then that Moran's file made clear I needed to get Scholz's file. I was surprised Scholz even had a file. That took another 2 years. So it took 6 years just to do the research. So you have to be, with FOIA today, it's kind of a crapshoot on how big the file is in terms of how quickly you're going to get the file released. As far as archives goes, I'm a former archivist. My first professional job was in a church archive. I'm a big promoter of preservation of documents, particularly so valuable as this. And I have connections with the archival community in Boston I can put you in touch with to talk to people about. There's so many smaller archives, even kind of religiously affiliated archives, that are doing it the right way, particularly in Boston. And Boston has an archival community that's very interested in just this. And I think the importance of this archive is very, very special and needs to be maintained.
Yes, I was born in 1941, and my first 7 years of schooling were in a Catholic school. So I know how violently anti-communist the church was back in those years. And I recall Pastor Martin Niemöller in Germany spoke about the rise of Hitler, that first they came for the communists, then they came for the socialists, then the trade unionists, then the Jews. But the first group that they came after were in Dachau, was built for political prisoners, the first prison. So the reason I'm mentioning all this is when you mention the appeal of Catholics back during this period of time to Nazism.
Right.
I think a lot of people in these days connect Hitler and Nazism strictly with anti-Semitism, whereas it wasn't at first. The first group he went after was the communists. And my question is, in your research, did you find that was the appeal, like to Charles Lindbergh, to Henry Ford, that first and foremost they were anti-communists? The anti-Semitism was incidental.
Right. Yeah, so very good question. What I found in my research is that, it's a really broad question. It's a question that has huge ramifications for what I do, because I'm looking at kind of early Christian nationalists, the formation of early Christian nationalism, and it's grounded in Judeo-Bolshevism, that one principle that Father Coughlin professed, which talked about the anti-Semitism in a lot of these Christians is grounded in this myth that Coughlin promotes, that that means that that Jews were present at the creation of communism. That Marx was a Jew. I mean, his paternal grandfather was a rabbi. That Lenin was Jewish. Now, they didn't know Lenin was Jewish then. We know through DNA that Lenin had Jewish ancestry now. And so there's this kind of fixation by the Nazis and by the fascists that basically that communism is basically a secular form, as a political secular form of Judaism, and that the two are symbiotic anyway. What I find as part of the appeal, in addition to the anti-Semitism, is that it's clear that the communists want to eradicate Christianity globally. It's not so clear that the Nazis want to do so. They want to mangle Christianity, but Alfred Rosenberg, who's Hitler's big philosopher of Christianity, he wants to create a new style of Christianity. But he doesn't want to get rid of Christ. Like, it's going to be an Aryan Christ. It's going to be an Aryan Jesus. Susanna Heschel writes this book. But they're not proposing to annihilate Christianity. So when faced with the two options, and Scholz had his degree from a PhD in psychology from Leipzig, and he's a Lutheran. This is how he kind of manipulates Moran to be kind of move more into the Nazi camp through that anti-communism. Now, what's very interesting is in that period where Moran is being recruited by Scholz, Scholz is also using communists as agents as well as anti-communists, because again, the Soviet Union and the Nazis are in this pact, which is essentially a military alliance. And so, but he can't, Scholz is not going to tell Moran, who's a Catholic anti-communist, that, on Monday he's meeting with Moran and on Tuesday he's meeting with a communist spy. He's not going to tell him that. But the appeal in many ways for a lot of these Christians is that the option is that Christ for the Nazis is not going to be obliterated, whereas for the communists it's a secular, entirely it's a movement to eradicate Christianity from the face of the earth in their view.
We have a question from Charlie.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering if the Irish Catholic sentiment, Ireland have been a colony of Britain for so many years, and there was a certain amount of anti-British sentiment among the Irish, how much that played into all this. And a totally separate minor question is that there's an organization called Spontaneous Celebrations that took over what had been a German social club at Jamaica Plain, and it heard there have been pro-Nazi meetings there. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, so I'll answer your last question first. One of the kind of difficulties for me now is that my book, which is a history book, has kind of forced me to become engaged with current events. And the problem is I'm a history professor, and I prefer living in the 1930s. And so I know I need to be less of a coward on this, and I need to kind of, but I also have an aversion to creating what you might say is a usable past. I find the past to be discrete and should be studied in its own context. So to answer your question, I don't know much at all of anything about the Patriotic Front. I don't know much about this German club that you're talking about. I know that a lot of this movement is becoming more and more, I wouldn't say prevalent, but it's popping up more and more, particularly in New England, because New England has this legacy, this past. But it's tough for me to become a commentator on current events, because I think as a historian, I just kind of cringe at that, and I probably do. I I kind of merge into the cardinal sin that I accuse the others of in being, let's leave that for the political scientists. So I don't know much about that. And your first question was about the anti-Irish sentiment. Clearly, Moran plays into that. Boston is a hub of Irish Catholic pro-Coughlin activity. It's an immigrant church, and it's predominantly anti-communist and anti-British. Duff Cooper, who would become Winston Churchill's, I think, secretary of one of the high cabinet secretaries, he came to speak in Boston in 1940, and Moran picketed that group, vocally picketed that group. Moran's political activity mirrored a lot of what the communists were doing as well. But there was a very active communist party in Boston in the 1930s and 1940s. They ran candidates for governor in 1940 here in Boston, and a lot of there was a real kind of back and forth between the Communist Party of Massachusetts, led by a guy named Otis Hood, and Moran, the Christian Front. And Moran thought what he was doing when he was trying to undermine the Communist Party of Massachusetts was basically a religious crusade for him, and so did many other Catholics.
Steve Kellerman, join us. It's a pleasure to have this retired machinist and amazing passionate history buff, Steve Kellerman.
Oh, he's muted.
You're muted, Steve. If you could unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Father Gallagher, thank you so much for your presentation. It was fascinating. But my question is, when I first arrived in Boston in 1959, the Feeneyites were very prominent. Father Feeney was an anti-Semitic Catholic priest who had meetings on the Common, was very vociferous, and ended up in conflict with Cardinal Cushing, and eventually got excommunicated by Cardinal Cushing and moved his operation to Worcester. Is there a connection between the history you described and the Feeneyites?
Very good question. The connection that I found was that Leonard Feeney, who's the controversial anti-Semitic Jesuit of the 1950s, his father was a member of the Christian Front and an informant for the FBI. In his reports, so of course Feeney would never know this, that his father was an informant for the FBI. In Feeney Sr.'s reports to the FBI, he colors his reports by kind of indicating that the Christian Front is first and foremost religious, which basically pushes the FBI into a hands-off attitude because of the First Amendment, and then that they're more or less a benign organization, and that Moran is a very well-educated Catholic who speaks theologically and not politically. And so Feeney's father, I think, unintentionally kind of pushes the FBI away from being curious and skeptical about the Christian Front, really until the sedition case of 1940. But there is a connection. And whether Leonard Feeney, and his brother was also a Jesuit, but whether those Feeney brothers knew that their father was, they clearly must have known their father was a member of the Christian Front. Whether they knew that he was kind of meeting with FBI officials is another question. And I don't know what they would have thought about that.
Thank you.
Anything else online, Omar? Russ Ziegler, will you join us? And you have to unmute. Russ, are you there?
Yeah, he just has a hand up.
Okay, maybe we'll get to Russ a little bit later, but I wanted to talk a little bit about community church and its history in the early days of uh, seriously being a very powerful secular Jewish place, kind of like the New York communist Jews and a lot you'll find, including some still living members, mixed marriages. Jewish person married to a Catholic person. Oh, that was a huge no-no in that day. Any kind of mixed racial or religious marriage. Here they found a home, and Lothrop performed many of these marriages, and that leads to the early history of the church being very affiliated with Zionism. Early on, we had several very prominent rabbis who spoke. Stephen Wise, for example, the father and son Brickner, Shubo.
Right.
It's a very strong connection there. In 1948, Lothrop delivered a sermon. I can't find the transcript. It's called Christianity and the Hope of Zionism, and basically understandable. The Holocaust has just happened. The hope of Israel as a place for Jews to find refuge. Since then, after that, an interesting speaker. Her name was Dorothy Thompson. Dorothy Thompson was a prominent journalist in the period between the wars. First American journalist to interview Adolf Hitler, and immediately got ejected from Germany. And she's been called the Edward R. Murrow of the woman version of Edward R. Murrow.
I wouldn't go that far. I've actually read that interview she did with Hitler, and what came out of it was that she dismissed Hitler as a non-force in politics and predicted that he wouldn't amount to anything. So I'm not sure I'd go as far as
Okay. Well, maybe that's why she got kicked
but
out.
she has her champions, that's for sure.
Right. One place she went, and we're getting past our 1 o'clock deadline, but it doesn't matter. It's just so rich for us. She did an interview. I'm sorry. After 48, she went to Gaza, and she reported from there. And there's some footage you can find on YouTube, where she is talking about the horrific, dire conditions of Palestinians kicked out of what is now Israel, especially those places right next to Gaza, where there are now all the kibbutz, and she's reporting about this, and guess what? She gets blacklisted worse than Lothrop. It's blacklisted. She loses all of her journalistic positions. Columnist with Ladies Home Journal, reporter for the New York Post. Nothing, and she becomes a lecturer. And one of her stops is Community Church of Boston, and that 1952 she speaks here. Lothrop wants her back to speak more on that situation. Anyway, it's just the tip of the iceberg of what you can find in our archives about our history with several different issues.
Yeah, there are so many huge names that rolled through this church. And from that period, from the 30s to the 60s, it's just, and that's near a lot of his political historians like to write about the 60s, the fervent kind of times of the 60s. But what gets lost is that history from the 20s really through the 60s, where people like Lothrop were kind of on the advanced edge of what would become the 60s. They were bringing in huge names socially and in terms of social justice, to talk here in Boston. And it's, I mean, your archive is extremely important from the historical perspective, as far as I'm concerned, precisely for these issues. Yeah.
I can smell lunch. My stomach feels it too. On that wonderful note, we want to conclude today's amazing presentation and invite you to become more engaged with us if you want to find out about our 3 different archives that are up there. 3rd floor, an enormous collection of Sacco and Vanzetti primary source materials that have been really lovingly, meticulously curated and archived by our wonderful friend, almost a new member of our team, Jerry Kaplan, retired from Harvard University Press, is now just dedicated to this amazing collection we got from Bob Datilio. 4th floor, the History Project. Celebrates, documents, and archives Boston's LGBT history. 5th floor, our own historical archives that are 104 years of history of Community Church of Boston, this institution, this thorn in the side of the dominant paradigm here in the city of Boston and the state of Massachusetts and the planet Earth. Join us again next week for Pashtana Durrani from Afghanistan, and on and on. If you'd like to be on our mailing list or let us be in touch with you, please be in touch with us, and we will add you to our list and let you know what's coming up, both speakers as well as musicians, storytellers, poets. We've got it. Come see us. We have an open house every Wednesday at noon. We serve pupusas. Our Salvadoran cook brings them from Chelsea, and we'd be glad to give you a tour of what we got here and tell you more about who we are, about our past, our present, and our future and what is to come. Thank you to all of those last night who sang Joni Mitchell songs and raised a bunch of money for Doctors Without Borders. And we wish you a wonderful week. Make good progress, do good work, and get into good trouble. Thank you, Charlie Gallagher, for being with us. And we say over and out until we meet again.